All right, this next question is for David Wood. It's from Renee, and it says, David, what were your overall thoughts about your debate with Shabir on the resurrection? Do you feel like there were certain points he was inconsistent on or struggled to refute?
Uh, well, of course, if you're adopting any Islamic position on the life of Jesus, you have to be inconsistent. You have no choice in the matter, because the moment you decide to be consistent, either you have to accept things that Islam rejects about Jesus, or you have to reject Islam. You have to do one or the other, and either one of those forces you to reject Islam. So the only thing you can do is be inconsistent, and sort of your goal in a debate like this is to bring that to the surface. And so, going against Shabir, I understand even before the debate gets going that he's going to be firing off lots of things, not always going to be able to respond to all of those things. But you think, normally beforehand, I would ask myself, if the audience is going to walk out of there remembering one thing, one point, what would it be? And so before the debate even started, I wanted people to understand the inconsistency. And the reason was because it was one of our early debates. It was on ABN. And we had a debate and it dealt with Jesus. And we're discussing these points along the way. And I didn't realize until afterwards that I don't think I pointed out during the debate that if Shabir applied the methods he's applying to the Bible, if he applied those same methods to Islamic sources, that it would absolutely wreak havoc on Islam, and that he doesn't. So I didn't point that out. So this debate, I wanted to make sure I sort of hammered that home. And so, when he's citing these scholars that hold positions that are rejected by virtually everyone else, and then even the people he's quoting don't agree with him. They don't agree with him that Jesus didn't die, or that they don't agree with him on these things. And yet he's putting it together so that it sounds like it does. You can do that, right? You can be as skeptical as you want to reject anything you don't want to believe. We talked about this before with regard to atheists, right? When an atheist comes to you and says, "Prove to me that God exists," I never start giving arguments for God's existence until I find out what sort of person I'm dealing with. Because if it's an atheist who's just going to come up with any ridiculous alternative to believing in God, guess what? The evidence is irrelevant to that atheist. And so normally if I'm talking to an atheist like that, I try to point out a problem with his methodology, that if he's just simply being as skeptical as possible to reject belief in God, well, you can do that with anything, right? And I point out that I could reject your existence, Mr. Atheist, if I adopt your methodology. That using your methodology, if you tried to prove to me that you existed, you couldn't do it. You'd say, "Oh, well, you see me here." Well, I mean, I could be dreaming. I could be a brain in a vat that some mad scientist is poking with needles to make me think that you're there. I could be in the Matrix. All sorts of things would explain why I think you're in front of me. And if I'm going to use absurd methodologies to avoid the fact, guess what? I could do that with your existence. So using the method that you use to deny the existence of God, I could use to deny the existence of you as an atheist or any other atheist, right? So notice it comes down to methodology and being consistent in methodology, and saying, if this is the method you're applying, then fine, apply that to other things and see where it gets you. And it doesn't get you where you think you're going to get. It doesn't get you science. It doesn't get you things like that, right? So you want to do the same thing with Muslims. If you're saying, here's my methodology when I examine the life of Jesus, that I can look and all of our sources say that Jesus died. If you somehow look at all of those sources and conclude that the secret hidden message is that Jesus didn't die, or if you look at scholars, every respected scholar on the planet, regardless of background, says that Jesus died by crucifixion. If you look at all of that and say, well, everyone got this wrong, the real answer is that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, then what you've done is you've become so radically skeptical that you're no longer within the realm of scholarship. You've fallen off the edge and are now in a pool of skepticism, right? Well, you can do that to reject something like Jesus' death. You can do that. You can become skeptical enough to do that. But is that really your methodology? Well, the only way you find out if that's really your methodology is saying, is that the method you apply to the Quran? Is that the method you apply to Muslim sources? And you find out Muslims don't do that. So every Muslim is inconsistent. Every Muslim does this, right? Every Muslim does this with the sort. They raise their skepticism levels to 10, and they find random oddball scholars to try and agree with individual points, and even those scholars don't agree with them. But they'll try and defend individual points that help them build some sort of case that is completely outside the realm of scholarship. And to pretend that this is where the evidence points, you can do that, but if they were even for a second to do that with their own sources, they couldn't even conclude that Muhammad existed, right? You would know nothing about Muhammad. You would know absolutely nothing about Muhammad if you applied those methods. And so, you want to drive that home, that Muslims don't apply the same level of skepticism to their sources. If they did, they couldn't even believe in Muhammad. And I pointed this out in the debate. That's what Muhammad Sven Kalish did. He said he spent years as a Muslim scholar and applying these skeptical, critical methods to the Bible, to the New Testament. And then he said, what happens if I apply the same methods to Islamic sources? And he came out and said, Muhammad probably never existed. So he's now an apostate, all because he tried to be consistent. That's what you have to do. Now, Muslims don't want to do that, and so they have to be inconsistent here. And so you certainly want people to walk away realizing that Shabir is being inconsistent. Now, to his credit, Shabir is more consistent than your average Muslim, certainly your average Muslim apologist, in that as I kept pressing him on that, hey, what would happen if we applied this method to your sources? Because you have to be skeptical of the stories in the Quran if you're using this method. You actually have to be far more critical of what the Quran says than you have to be of the New Testament. These are all first century documents. It makes sense to, even if you didn't believe they're inspired, even if you believe that it's coming out of a community where people are embellishing things, that's Shabir's position, you still have to take seriously, this is what they believe. That's why they're writing it down, right? So this is still first century records of people who are writing about Jesus. When you're talking about Muslim sources and Shabir's writing, Shabir's reading the Quran and he's looking at what it says, and the Quran's talking about Jesus. Now you're centuries later. How do you take these stories seriously, especially when the Quran is talking about Mary giving birth under a palm tree, Jesus giving life to clay birds? We know where these stories come from, and not just on the issue of Jesus. We talked about this in the debate. There's stories about Alexander the Great and the sleepers in the cave. We know exactly where these stories come from. We have the sources. Shabir, in order to get around the Bible, is positive. Yes, all these sources say that Jesus died, but there's these other sort of imaginary or hypothetical sources that we don't have, and maybe they pointed in some other direction. Well, if you're going to become that skeptical, when we talk about the Quran and what sources it's drawing from, we're not talking about imaginary sources. We have the sources. We read the sources. And so if you're going to say the Bible authors are embellishing, what do you do when the Quran describes Dhul Qarnayn, this is the 7th century term for Alexander the Great, as this devout Muslim? We know Alexander's as pagan as you can be. What do you do with this? He's obviously embellishing a story about Alexander the Great for the purpose of defending Islam. So what do you do with this? How do you take this seriously? And after sort of pushing this over and over again, which again, if that's the point you want to drive home, you have to keep doing. By the end, Shabir was willing to grant that he said he compared stories in the Quran to stories about comic book heroes, right? He compared them to Marvel movies, right? If you're talking about the Hulk and you're using a story about the Hulk, it's not because you take it seriously. It's because you think you can make some point that you're trying to illustrate using that as an example. So maybe, this is Shabir's position, maybe these stories in the Quran about Dhul Qarnayn, about Jesus giving life to clay birds, about these stories that we find in the Quran, maybe the Quran isn't really saying these happened. Maybe the Quran is using fictitious stories, things that were made up to make points for Islamic purposes. And that's fine. Notice that's, in one sense, that's good. He's being more consistent than other Muslims. But there's a problem that arises here. So to his credit, he's being more consistent, but think about the implications. Now, any story in the Quran that you don't want to take seriously, you just say, maybe the Quran's using a fictitious story here. And notice what it's doing. So it's not saying that Alexander the Great was actually a devout Muslim. It's just using that and making up stories about him being a devout Muslim for some Islamic purpose. Well, how do you then, where do you draw the line if the Quran is doing this? And so to his credit, he is more consistent, but notice what just happened. He's still nowhere near as skeptical of the Muslim sources as he is of Christian sources. And yet, just applying a tiny bit of the same level of skepticism led him to compare Quran stories to comic book stories. And so, my Muslim friends, that should clue you in. The methods that you use when you go to the Bible. What happens when you even start to apply those to the Quran? Well, at the very least, you have to go the route that Shabir's gone, right? Oh, it's like comic books. The Quran's like comic books. Or if you really want to be completely consistent, we know what happens there. Muhammad's Sven Kalish. Muhammad never existed. So be consistent. If you're going to apply those methods to the Bible, apply them to the Quran, and you'll have to become some sort of generic theist, or you'll have to become an atheist or an agnostic or something. You have to go that route. Or you can reject the methodology. You can say, hey, I'm not going off the deep end with quoting oddball scholars. I'm going to, figure out where the evidence actually points. And wherever the evidence points, even if it disagrees with me, that's where I'm going to go. And if you do that, you're still going to have to reject Islam. So you're going to have to reject Islam either way. Your only alternative is to be completely inconsistent, to have one set of rules, one set of methods that you apply to non-Islamic things, completely different methods when you address the Muslim sources. But guess what? If your position forces you to be inconsistent and illogical, probably not a good position.
And a quick follow-up question for that, because I had a lot of Muslims write on my video that you were inconsistent in the debate. They said because you were quoting like atheist scholars who didn't agree with Christianity, and so could you just kind of highlight the difference between quoting a person, or I mean a scholar, like what is the reason for quoting the scholar, and then how it relates to facts?
Yeah, I understand that if you're not really paying attention to how we're quoting scholars, you might say, oh, David's quoting the Jesus Seminar, Shabir's citing the Jesus Seminar, David criticizes Shabir for quoting the Jesus Seminar, but David used the Jesus Seminar too. So isn't David being inconsistent? I actually addressed this in the debate where I pointed out that when I quote the Jesus Seminar, I'm saying here are people who reject almost everything you could think of, right? They're on the political spectrum, they would be neo-Nazis. They're nice guys, but that's how far off in left field they are in terms of historical Jesus scholarship. Very few people take them seriously in the realm of scholarship. The point of me quoting them was to say, even these guys who disagree with everything they could possibly reject still regard Jesus' death by crucifixion as indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar said that even if we didn't have the Bible, we would still know that Jesus died. You know, from Josephus and Tacitus. So these are the guys that are as critical as you can possibly be and still be qualified as a scholar, and they agree with me, right? So what I did was I quoted a bunch of people who were non-Christians. I specifically said even non-Christians agree with me on this point, non-Christian scholars. So I cited Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman actually has some decent stuff, right? But he's an agnostic. I quoted Jewish scholars, and I cited even sort of radical liberal scholars. The point of that was there's a consensus here. I'm drawing attention to a consensus. Everyone across the board who is still qualified in the realm of scholarship says David Wood is right on this issue. Just so that people don't think that I'm just giving some off-the-wall theory that's my personal theory, and I'm just going to quote some random scholar to back up my position. I'm citing everyone who disagrees with me, disagrees with me on everything else, pointing out on this issue, everyone agrees. And that's to show that the evidence that I gave, that's everyone agrees on the implications of that evidence. So people, because you're talking to the audience hasn't studied all these things. The point is, everyone who studies these things and is an expert says I'm right, so take that seriously. Right? If you said all scientists in this field agree on something, that should persuade your average person. There must be some reason they all agree on this, right? So that's why I'm citing people like the Jesus Seminar. When Shabir cites the Jesus Seminar, it's to give some off-the-wall date for the book of Acts that no one else agrees with. So guess what? You can do that, right? I could say, hey, Muhammad Sven Kalish, he's a scholar of Islamic studies, and he says Muhammad never existed. No one would take that argument seriously. Why? Because everyone else agrees that Muhammad existed. So you can always quote a guy to defend some absurd position that no one else agrees with. That tends to be how Shabir uses scholarship, right? He'll find it can be a good scholar, like Raymond Brown's a good scholar. He was a brilliant scholar. So you can quote someone like that and give some position that no one else agrees with that this guy gave a little unique argument for. or Wolfhard Pannenberg or something like this, and give some individual argument from that person that no one else agrees with. You can do that. That does not mean that you have a good position. That doesn't mean that you have a strong position. So the difference between how we're using the scholars, I'm using them to show that there's a consensus, that everyone across the board, even people who differ with me radically, nevertheless agree, because that usually shows that there's a strong reason for the consensus. Shabir's quoting people who disagree with the consensus, because that's the only thing he can do, right? You can just say, well, here's a guy who said it.
Yeah.
Well, you can do that with anything, right? Again, I can quote you guys who say Muhammad never existed or probably never existed. I could cite guys like that. The question is, do I have good reasons for that? If there were a consensus, then you'd have to start asking why there's a consensus. But if it's just, hey, let me tell you a scholar who said something, you can find a scholar who said almost anything about Jesus, right? From Jesus was a violent revolutionary who wanted to overthrow the Romans, all the way to Jesus was this nice, the Jesus seminars, he's basically this nice little hippie guy who went around, handing out flowers and telling everyone peace and love, right? So you have everything from violent lunatic, hell-bent on starting a bloody revolution, all the way to, peaceful hippie. And you can defend everything in between. You could always find a scholar to say anything between those things. But just saying, hey, there's some scholar who says this, that doesn't tell you that it really happened. When you end up with a consensus among people from every sort of background who all conclude the same thing about Jesus, there's usually reason for that. And what's cool is when you do that, when you say, what do people across the board agree with? Jesus died by crucifixion. That was the message that his early apostles were teaching. And they were all convinced, his early apostles, that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. So I take it, if that's the consensus, then whatever facts we're going to say about Jesus, it has to start with the things that we know. Your view of Jesus, it had better incorporate those things, or you have a Jesus that just wasn't a real Jesus. The Islamic Jesus doesn't fit with the most basic facts that we know about Jesus, and so Muslims are forced to use a methodology similar to the one that Shabir used, namely, let me sort of piece together certain things that various people have said that no one else agrees with and make my position sound more plausible, and it just doesn't work like that.
And in addition to, because you kind of pointed out how he would quote people that didn't even agree with the position that he was arguing for, right? So I mean,
he liked to cite, he was citing Dan Smith, right? Because Dan Smith is arguing based on Q, a book that we don't have. It's a hypothetical document. And Shabir was trying to build a position based on Q, that the real view is translation. He's using that view of translation, but so as opposed to resurrection from the dead. And so he's arguing that the original position of Q, which we don't even have Q, but he's arguing that there was some original position and Jesus didn't die. But guess what? Even Dan Smith believes that Jesus' death is assumed in Q. So even the guy he's citing rejects what he's arguing. But notice, if you don't know that, you're walking out of there, you think, no, and I did say it briefly. I said, look at the title of the book. It's on the post-mortem. It's on the post-mortem, right? But notice, if you're not paying close attention, you walk away and saying, oh, Shabir's quoting these scholars and he's got this, he's defending it. So maybe Jesus didn't die. So you got to pay attention. But notice, even there, he's citing scholars defending a position that the guy he's citing rejects. And guess what? Why? You have to do that. You have to do that because everyone who's in the realm of scholarship says Jesus died. And so you have to do it.
Good. All right. What's up, guys? Hope you guys enjoyed the video. And just so you know, this video is part of a series of videos that is going to be released over the next couple of months, slowly but surely. And those videos are going to include interviews with David Wood, Vocab Malone, and myself. So if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. And also make sure you hit the bell so that way you make sure not to miss any of our new content. All right? I'll see you guys soon. Peace.